Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's discussion, Everyday Leadership, with our special guest, Dr. Heidi Brooks, Senior Lecturer in Organizational Behavior at the Yale School of Management. My name is Alex Baran-Perea. I am co-founder of Ivy Exec, and it is a true pleasure to have Ivy Exec host our session today. I'm honored to be here alongside Dr. Brooks, of course, who will help us gain perspective and an appreciation for how everyday actions today sets our leadership trajectory for tomorrow. And this webinar will provide a glimpse into, as Dr. Brooks has mentioned to us in our preparations, a glimpse into the future direction of work. And it's a future where we as leaders take into consideration human nature when seeking to unlock our organization's full potential. But before we begin, and I hand it over to my colleagues at Yale, we have a few brief housekeeping items that we want to make sure that you're all aware of as our attendees. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode, being that this is a webinar. However, we want to encourage you to engage in our session today by submitting your questions to Dr. Brooks, which you can do so at any time. We would encourage you to send your questions throughout using the chat feature in your Zoom control panel. My colleague and counterpart that will join us at opportune moments, Emily Gordon from the Yale School of Management, will be collecting those questions on your behalf, and we'll share those with Dr. Brooks at the opportune moments throughout our discussion today. Additionally, we'd like to hear from you, and Dr. Brooks will invite us to reflect and share our thoughts around the changing nature of work. So please, not only do we hope to have you submit your questions for Dr. Brooks, but to also provide your commentary, your thoughts, your opinions, your views on the subject matter that we're discussing. We'll also have a poll question that we will be launching in the first few minutes of our session today. And should timing allow, we'll be mindful of everyone's time. We'll have a final Q&A session at the very end of our 1 hour together. And finally, we are recording this session, so please be on the lookout for an email from our team here at Ivy Exec with a copy of the recording, should you wish to access the content following today's event. And it's now my pleasure to pass it over to Wendy Sung, Assistant Dean of the MBA for Executives program at the Yale School of Management, who will introduce you to our distinguished guests for today. Wendy?
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm delighted to welcome all of you today to today's discussion with Dr. Heidi Brooks. As Alex says, my name is Wendy Sung, and I serve as the Assistant Dean of the MBA for Executives program. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to share a little bit about our program. Our MBA program is designed for mid-career working professionals who are interested in doing a deep dive into one of 3 areas of focus at the nexus of business and society. And those are asset management, healthcare, and sustainability. Our students complete the program over a 22-month period during which they attend classes in person on the Yale University campus in New Haven, Connecticut, every other weekend on Friday and Saturday. They can also leverage our extended classroom technology to attend remotely when necessary. Class weekends include optional social activities to get to know the university and Saturday workshops to enhance their professional development delivered by top members across the Yale faculty. The program begins with a 2-week residency period in July, and students study and travel internationally through a required Global Network Week. And then they start their second year with an initial week of residency. Throughout their 2 years, students participate in Colloquia, a speaker series curated by our faculty directors, where leaders in business and academia share their experience, expertise, and insights. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heidi Brooks, who teaches and advises on the subject of everyday leadership, the everyday micro moments of impact that shape our lived experiences. Creating more courageous communities, especially within organizations, is a particular passion of hers. Dr. Brooks specializes in large-scale culture change projects focused on individual and collective leadership effectiveness in organizations. Interpersonal dynamics, the MBA elective she has taught for 15 years, is one of the courses most in demand at Yale School of Management. Dr. Brooks pioneered the Everyday Leadership course at SOM, where she first taught the principles of everyday leadership. She has also taught emotional intelligence, power and politics, managing groups and teams, and coaching skills for managers. Dr. Brooks received her doctorate in psychology from the University of California at Berkeley and a bachelor's degree from Brown University. A lifelong experiential learner, you can find her as a student in classrooms as far-ranging as improvisational theater and immersion language lessons. I know Dr. Brooks' hope for work to be more human and sustainable will be infused into today's very engaging session. We hope this opportunity to hear from Dr. Brooks will offer insight not only into her important work, but also into how our faculty at Yale SOM regularly brings their research into the classroom. Emily Gordon, my colleague at Yale, will help to manage the chats and questions, as Alex said, along the way. So with that, welcome, Dr. Brooks, and thank you so much for spending this time with us today.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Wendy. And hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm glad for a chance to talk with you about everyday leadership. I have been teaching at Yale since 2003, and Wendy made reference to one of my courses, the interpersonal and group dynamics course. I teach an everyday leadership course, and I'm also the chair of the new art committee. Those are my activities this year. In the spirit of being the chair of the art committee, even though I'm relatively new to the world of art, I thought I might introduce my friend here, since my family has made a recent sculptural acquisition, and which you might experience because I've got this figure behind me of the Minotaur. And so there's a Minotaur reading a book, which I thought I would introduce. You can actually, you might have some ideas of what this book is, because I would introduce it. I thought I'd introduce it because it's relevant to some of the spirit of this work. And so, at least in the way that I experience this sculpture, the idea is that we might need to intentionally bring some wisdom into our lives, point our attention towards the direction of wisdom in order to help us conquer, perhaps, or live with our more base nature. And since we're undertaking this webinar and conversation as we are in the context of a pandemic, and perhaps at the precipice of World War, I thought I would just kind of name some of the way that I experienced that sculpture. And since people have been commenting on it as I've been working remotely, and since he's in my view here, I thought you might notice I am taking naming suggestions. So if you'd like to help me name the sculpture, please feel free. This is probably not where it will live forever. This is just where they plopped it when they came in. But that's by way of welcome. Really glad you're here. So I thought I would also start with a little quote from Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, this piece that I'll just simply read to you, that we become builders building, we become harpists by playing the harp. Therefore, we become just by doing just actions, temperate by doing temperate actions, brave by doing brave actions. And I thought I'd bring that to you today because as far as I'm concerned, everyday leadership is partly about what we are doing that's visible and invisible to us. These kind of junctures of everyday living and life that wind up having impact that I think we need to increase our attention and intention around. And so I have the perspective that we get better at what we practice, whether we're aware of that or not, and whether that's war or busyness or inequity or living with stress, or we're in the practice of kindness and connection or pursuit of rigor and excellence. Sometimes we're just not conscious of our practice. So I hope that some of this conversation today may increase your attention to what you're practicing, what your organization and context is in the practice of, and ask, is that what we want to be practicing? Because we become what we are practicing. It's also really worth stating that this time, this context, these last several years, this set of events that's evolving around potential world war has impact on us, whether we live in the kind of region of the Ukraine or elsewhere. We're all impacted, perhaps not in the same ways, but we're impacted. And we are in a time when we're undergoing a great change. The pandemic and the context of conversations like equity at work, racial equity more broadly in the globe, differential impact around the pandemic. These are all contexts which are changing. I want to also point to the ongoing change that was already underway, but has escalated in the face of the pandemic, of the changing face of work. And so I brought you some words from the CEO at Microsoft. This idea that over the past year that we have undergone more rapid transformation. This quote is old at this point. You know, the past year has brought some new conversations, but this one I really wanted to underscore here, that we really need to take a look at productivity much more broadly, so that we're defining productivity in a way that includes collaboration, learning, and well-being. That was a nice kind of way of underscoring some of the pieces that I was hoping that we would pay attention to today. Getting a comment that I need to be at full screen, but I think I'm at full screen. Is that not true? Can someone please let me know?
You're fine, Dr. Brooks. We made an adjustment now.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so here's one of the questions that I have, which is, what are we building today with our everyday actions? With the assertion that we are, you know, there's a connection between today and tomorrow, that we are creating tomorrow with the trajectory of our everyday actions today. I really like to look at this question of, where do we want to be in 10 years or 10 months or 10 days or 10 minutes? And how can we draw a line from what we're doing right now into that future? Right? I call this a kind of telescoping skill, just kind of taking the capacity to shift our perspective out of the urgency of now, out of the demand set that we are also buffeted by, the kind of stress, the kind of tyranny of now that often commands 100% and more of our attention. What can we do to actually step out of that stress and ask, what are we building with our kind of reactivity? And can we telescope into a future and find at the end of our lens a vision of what we're creating that we actually want to be part of? So I think this kind of telescoping and building of tomorrow, developing ourselves, our teams, our organizations into our a capacity of a future that we want to be part of is part of the domain of everyday leadership. If every day is really about now and micro moments, it also has a view into the future. And so I'm worried, I spend a lot of time teaching students at Yale and in conversations about how they're experiencing their organizations, how they're experiencing work, what their hopes are to be able to create down the line. And I'm not sure that we are pointing ourselves in our everyday practices in any given organization towards a future that we're excited about. And so I'm hoping it's the domain of people who are interested in building something towards the future, and they're leading every day to be able to shift our perspective. So a lot of what we're doing in this conversation is to ask, how are we building a future that we want to be part of? I also spend a lot of time with companies, and it's a real struggle to be able to carve out the time out of our reactive days to be able to reflect and think and strategize and plan for and develop capacity for tomorrow. So we have a kind of functional time problem in both handling the hyper productivity of kind of norms of every day, and to have time to create a tomorrow, which also needs some intention today. So in order to be able to do that, I thought I would take a look at some everyday junctures. So where does this all get enacted? becomes the question. So one of the ways that I think about this is, that work kind of takes place in these everyday junctures. If we think outside of role descriptions, outside of job descriptions, outside of kind of grandiose moments, and it's not erasing those things, just looking at some of the interstitial space. I like to think about these everyday junctures because work life has everyday junctures, these places and events that regularly and pretty predictably occur. It turns out our work lives are filled with these kind of everyday junctures, these kind of ordinary events that happen across workplaces, like introductions, like feedback and framing in meetings, collaboration and decision-making. And I want to be able to shape everyday junctures to be moments that matter. Right? Not every moment has to be, kind of filled with intention, but too many of our moments aren't filled with an intention to create the kind of organizational and the kind of lived experience that will help us to populate an experience of work that we actually want. I think that, I'm on the kind of line of thinking that work is not really working for humans. We've got to reinvent. And so this is an invitation in that direction. So when thinking about everyday junctures, I thought I'd ask you about yours so you can get a sense of who's showing up here and kind of give this a little bit of texture and nuance from this audience today. So I'll ask you to put into the chat, what are the kind of key everyday junctures that make up your days? Let me give you an example from my work. So you know that I teach at Yale School of Management. And so sometimes I'm teaching right here, but sometimes I'm at a podium. We are in person at this point. And so I'm going to talk with you about going to the classroom. So I have 3 different stakeholder groups I interact with, for the most part: students, faculty, and staff. I love to spend time with alums, but for the most part, every day I'm with faculty, students, and staff. With students, a key everyday juncture takes place in the classroom, before and every day and after class, every day at the podium. So for me, podium interactions wind up being a key everyday juncture. And so it matters to me, to be able to kind of set the tone of welcome and conversation. So I like to be able to welcome people and talk with them more casually before and after class. And I think also of the other faculty, committee moments, like when I'm kind of co-teaching. These have a lot of kind of everyday junctures, how we coordinate through the syllabus, which the students are also impacted by. And then there's the staff, the kind of individuals running the operations, with whom some days I rarely overlap with the staff, and yet they are setting the conditions for me to be able to thrive and to function. So it's really worth thinking about the junctures where we interact. We have different audiences in our days, different people to take into account, different ways to think about who and when, with whom and how we're having impact and being impacted. So I wonder if you wouldn't be willing to be able to put into the chat some everyday examples of your everyday junctures. Hey, Azad, fantastic to see your comment in there. The daily cadence calls, great. Thanks, Alex. Okay, Abby Gottlieb, fantastic. This is great. Some familiar faces and names. Morning check-in with analysts, great. Keep going. This will give you also an idea of who's kind of showing up to these calls and into this webinar. Interviews, workshops, and feedback sessions. Thanks, Abby. Good. Mantras and affirmations before the start of the day. Thanks, Rochelle. Interact with contractors. Thank you, William. Team meetings, KPI interviews. Okay, okay, let's see. These are starting to go so quickly, I can't read them before they go by. Coffee break huddles. Staff meetings, opening with check-ins, open office hours, interactions with peers in hallways, clients on email. Okay, great. let's see, staff meetings, daily meetings. Thank you, Heather. Okay, good. So this starts to give us a sense for who the people who are showing up, and feel free to keep popping those in as I speak here, because I'm still talking about everyday moments. If you were to describe your work, these might not be the things that you would mention, but these might be the places where you're really creating and experiencing your organization. So paying attention to lived experience, what people are not just, kind of not what we just described more formally in a job description, but the kind of lived experience moments that actually create our feelings about work, our sense of engagement and aliveness and interest and intrigue, how and where we get to know each other, where we kind of learn the rules of the road and get to know others. Okay, great. We've got some really nice examples in here, and most of them are written publicly. There are a few of them that are written just to me or the panelists, but I think you're able to see some of the examples of what people have been saying. Okay, so let me continue here in that same spirit. So part of what I do with Everyday Junctures is ask this question of what's enlivening and what's depleting? What's enlivening and what's depleting? In the spirit that our work is actually having impact on us. And from an everyday lens, we want to look not at grandiose questions of, did we build a building, or did we, create a new movement? That's hard to do within an everyday mindset. Important strategic questions, but looking every day at the kind of partner leadership to strategic leadership, looking every day. We want to look at an everyday metric that makes sense. And so we want to look at affective impact in the everyday. So here I've brought you this kind of basic idea of enlivening and depleting. So moments that matter that are enlivening. So when I've asked this question before, we've got your examples in the chat, and I've put other examples on the screen of some things that people tend to talk about. So maybe someone in the spirit of kind of introducing you does so in a kind of touching or more accurate fashion. It turns out that introductions, matter for the way that we see and perceive others, because we're basically translating people in some ways, telling people how to see each other. Maybe you wind up getting helpful or timely feedback. We tend to be pretty bad at in organizations at giving feedback that's helpful and timely. We wait too long, or we have no feedback, or we give vague feedback with good intentions of professionalism, but often so vague that it sounds like, kind of keep doing what you're doing, and that's just not enough to help people grow. So maybe in an enlivening day, you have a moment that matters where someone has given you helpful and timely feedback. Maybe the return to in-person team meetings people have found enlivening. So this is a recent one. Despite all of the kind of confusion and perhaps resistance about the actual commute, seeing colleagues has given people a bit of a boost. So I'm hearing this one from them on the enlivening side of things. In the spirit of collaboration, there's a lot of, part of collaboration is getting people on the same page. People have named that it's enlivening when people buy into your idea, especially if it happens in a relatively straightforward way as you're socializing some concept or product. And then perhaps in the decision-making domain, that people are kind of implementing a new policy with integrity. These are moments that matter that people have talked about as being more enlivening. And so if it's enlivening, we can ask a little bit more of a detailed question of how did you feel? And so we get some of the kind of associated feelings with this that people have offered. And so, when I talk about noticing everyday impact, and I'm talking about feelings, sometimes people go kind of to the deep and dark side. And sometimes people go kind of bigger than they need to. I'm really talking about everyday emotions. So it's human to have emotions. We do have emotions in the workplace. I'm talking about on a scale of 0 to 10. Maybe you're talking about a 2 or a 3. right? And so sometimes people go directly to the kind of 8, 9, 10 kind of domain. But these are more like, feeling warm or grateful or somewhat excited or nervous or, somewhat motivated or a sense of relief, right? These are the kind of things that kind of are in the more moderate domain, the more subtle, not necessarily big emotions. Yet the cumulative effect of these emotional experiences become our lived experience of organizations. Right. And so the question becomes, what kind of moments do you wind up experiencing as enlivening? All right. So from the examples that we start to see, and so from the examples that you've seen in the chat, what are the kind of things that you start feeling are enlivening in your work? Enlivening to you and perhaps to others. But not all good things are enlivening. So just looking at the other side of the coin. But before I go on, Emily, I see you're appearing there. Is there something for us to pay attention to here?
Yeah, I was inspired by the exchange in the chat about giving yourself a news diet. And is there a way, given that you started the session with talking about, war and politics, the pandemic, is there a way to somehow mesh the enlivening with the things that are happening in current events? Do we have to put those things aside to feel enlivened?
Okay, great. Well, so I appreciate that. And thanks for showing up to ask that question. So, part of what we can ask is, I'm asking this question in a specific way, which is what's enlivening to you? And if for you, the news is enlivening, you might be able to handle more of it. If for you, the news is depleting, you might want to actually put yourself on a more kind of restriction approach, which is, I think what people mean by a news diet. I think they're talking about kind of restriction approach. Don't do so much news, not so much social media. Don't bathe yourself in kind of negative messages about a world at war or kind of conversations about racial equity or declining climate change. So for me, I'm a little bit less, I'm less interested in making rules that are stable and steady in an acontextual way. And I'm more interested in paying attention to what is the impact of life on you? And can you bring yourself to a place of choice where you're paying attention to what kind of impact the world has on you and maybe doing what you can to engage some self-leadership so that you are kind of choicefully exposing yourself to factors that are enlivening and depleting. We can't entirely get rid of things that are depleting or entirely create a world that is enlivening, of course, but you might be able to create a sense of sustainability for yourself by bringing some more choice in. But I wouldn't say that it's a fixed rule for everyone on every day about everything, as much as it is being able to watch the impact on yourself of what's happening in your world. And news is a great example of an everyday moment right now that probably matters. And we might have different reactions to it. Some people are enlivened and feel much more informed and aware knowing what's going on. And some people feel more barraged and overwhelmed. It's much more depleting. And so you might need to decide where you are on that continuum and take it on in that way. I consider that a kind of self-leadership that's really quite important for your own sustainability in a kind of in a world that can be quite intense and always putting things in you and on your face. Can you actually bring yourself to a place where you trust yourself to sustain your own energy and protect yourself? And then if you can do that for yourself, you have a better chance of being able to do that for others. Because leadership at the end of the day, of course, isn't so much about you, but it is through you. So you need to be able to lead yourself in order to be able to lead others. So Emily, please keep coming back if there are other questions that I should pay attention to. Appreciate your voice there. Let's look at the depleting side, because we have moments that matter that are also depleting. And I'm sure you're getting the spirit of this, and you can see these examples that have stayed on screen this entire time. I'm still on the same path. So looking at introductions, some examples that people have given, I pulled this one of someone introduces you in a more dismissive way. And that's not necessarily all interpersonal. Sometimes it's just situational, that there's not time for kind of respectful introductions, but people are differently kind of responsive for reasons around related to What is the context? Are you kind of familiar or unfamiliar? Is it introducing power or status or negotiating that in some particular way? But no one likes to be introduced, of course, in a dismissive fashion. And sometimes we're not aware of actually the impact of our introductions on the audience and on the speaker in this case. What if you kind of receive kind of vague or delayed feedback? This is definitely an everyday occurrence in organizations that are actually doing feedback. We know that our kind of annual feedback approach is by structurally a delayed feedback mechanism. We know that those things are not working very well. And our everyday feedback is often vague. And over time, or in the actual instance, it can be depleting for people. Let me just do these other three, Emily, and then I'll come to you. We've got people who are giving lots of examples of like RTO plans keep getting delayed. There was supposed to be a kind of big return to office last summer. Then there was going to be a big return to office in October. And now we've kind of stopped announcing big returns to office in many places. And so people have found that kind of depleting. How do I pay attention? How do I plan for my life? Are we actually returning to office? Is there such a thing? Do I have an office anymore? Do I know where it is? Have I ever met the other people with whom I work? Is work real? Am I really a member of a team? All of these questions kind of are up, and people have found them sometimes. People have found them depleting. It's been a common example. What about this idea of not having enough kind of time or contact points to socialize your idea in a busy workplace? The productivity concerns keep kind of flying, but some of these ideas really need to be socialized when you're collaborating. Do you have enough contact points to actually talk with people about ideas that are coming in which they need to have some buy-in? And then around decision making, sometimes people don't hold the same idea around what implementation of something new actually looks like. And so you have a clear decision, but different kinds of implementation. So those are some of what's come up. So before I switch slides, Emily, what are you thinking?
Well, I know you have entire class sessions devoted to each of these subjects, but I wondered if you could give a quick example of someone introducing you in a dismissive way versus a way that honors you and gets you motivated and excited.
Oh, well, so this example came from a kind of participant at one point, and I thought it was a kind of nice one, but it also summed up something that I care about very much. So I was introduced at one point to a very kind of formal, kind of like white shirt and tie kind of audience, kind of jacket and tie kind of audience, in a very quick fashion. And I was, kind of new to the audience. And so they didn't know how to receive me. It's what they do is they kind of mimic the style of the introduction. And so I noticed that I was kind of being treated in a kind of dismissive fashion, and then wound up looking up some of the literature on introductions. And it turns out that introductions wind up being a kind of facilitator of kind of translation mechanism for how to perceive. We're very social. So we use cues in our social environment. And when all you know about someone is how they've been introduced, you take those cues. And in my case, where I have some status vulnerability in a predominantly white institution as a Black woman teaching, the cues of actually being kind of dismissive or just fast in an introduction can actually translate in ways that make it hard for me to give a talk to an audience. And so I wound up talking with people about this quite a bit and finding that people were kind of not aware, I wasn't even aware of this kind of very important everyday juncture of introducing people. And we're often out of alignment with what we intend. In the particular instance of the introduction that I was experiencing, it was a day we kind of got behind time in the schedule. And the person who was introducing me was very familiar with me, and we have a very casual relationship. And so it just was within our dynamic that we don't really do introductions between us. And so there was something that we actually had to kind of formalize and look at and kind of inquire into a moment that mattered. And so I started asking people about it. So that's how this example came up. Let me finish this slide because I also asked people this kind of specific feelings that they wound up having in this domain. And so here are some of the kind of lower level experiences that wound up coming up. And so the notice here, it's not like they were infuriated necessarily. right? It's kind of disappointed or frustrated or drained or fatigued, right? Or wind up feeling stressed. And because these emotions are kind of on a lower level, we tend to kind of ignore and dismiss. And so we're often in a kind of everyday habit of diminishing, suppressing, or ignoring emotion at our peril, because it's actually feedback about the impact of the day on us. And so this is a domain in which, regarding wellness, lived experience in organization, employee engagement, retention issues, questions of impact and effectiveness, we actually need to get more nuanced and attentive to the everyday impact that we're having on each other, the kind of organizational culture we're creating and what moments are creating that. So I thought what we might be able to do is to ask you about your own enlivening and depleting experiences. So I wonder if you might be willing to answer a quick poll that we brought for you. So Alex, this is the time to bring up the poll, if you would. So it says, has your week to date been more on the enlivening or depleting side? We mean this as a continuum. So was it enlivening, was it depleting, or was it really somewhere in between? Then we'll show you the answers. And these are anonymous, so we'll leave that up for a moment. We're just talking about this week. So we're here on a Thursday. And Alex, are you able to see whether we have enough to be able to start to show those results?
About 73% of the attendees that have completed it. So let's give them 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. I think you can see the results now. So 52 out of the 71.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So it's thank you for doing that, Alex, and thank you everyone for just being willing to share your response here. My primary point is that we tend to be kind of all over the map right now, and what was enlivening to you might be depleting to someone else. So we don't have a kind of fixed story, just as with the kind of news diet example. And so one of the things that we can ask is, what's the experience that other people are having? But we can also ask, what are the kind of moments that have been enlivening and depleting? So I wonder if we might be able to put a few examples of the kind of things that are enlivening to you or the kind of things that are depleting to you in the chat, just as an information point, and a little bit of, kind of stimulating a little bit of conversation and sharing in this exchange. So in addition to keeping questions coming as much as you'd like, if you'd be willing, I'd love to see a few examples of something enlivening from your week. You don't need to be deep and detailed, like feedback was enlivening or feedback was depleting, not being able to give feedback, receiving feedback, something like that. I'm feedback focused at this moment, but any examples from anywhere would be just a helpful thing. It's also a chance to just kind of reflect. What has been the impact of this week on you? And what are the moments that actually created that? Was it enlivening or depleting, right? Not grandiose, not going big scale, just thinking, what really has impacted you this week? Great. Yeah, Taha, repeating the same conversation to get an update, not know what's going on in the other person's schedule. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Heather. Having a staff member that I supervise tell me that they think I'm doing a good job. Great. Appreciate that. A little bit of encouragement. Okay, good. So enlivening, being back in person. Someone else enlivening, not going to the office. Not everyone can see all of these, I think. Okay, great. Thank you all. It's enlivening for me to see your responses and engagement, whether you're sharing something that's enlivening or depleting or somewhere in between. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Brooke. Left off meeting invites. Okay, appreciate that. Now, part of what I'm doing here is kind of giving information from me to you. Part of what I'm doing is kind of crowdsourcing information. But I'd love you to see this not just as information, but as perspectives that people are taking on this work. You're hearing some reflections from others. So we can actually take that in as hearing people's experience. Some people might feel a little bit vulnerable talking about these things, and some people might not. You don't necessarily know from what they're actually saying. So I'm going to keep going here. And, you heard me mention this word impact. So impact is the kind of central concept I'm really interested in terms of understanding our everyday leadership, because everyday leadership is about our impact in the everyday. Right. So like I've already talked about with the kind of news diet examples, I'm a little less concerned with specific behavior. So I don't want to make a list of the top 10 things you should be doing as though that is the answer. Those are kind of hypotheses. They're parts of your tool bag, your toolkit that might be able to help you produce a desired impact. But the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the impact. So I want you to have a robust toolkit, but the toolkit in itself is not enough for impact. We often get kind of in leadership development circles or thinking about how can I kind of improve my leadership or kind of get something done. We think about the behaviors in a kind of self-focused way, and we don't think enough about creating impact. So this lens is on creating impact. And then behaviors that do that are the ones that we want to, that might do that are the ones that we want to consider. So we want to have a broad range of tools and strategies in our tool bag and some capacity to understand and predict, to kind of foreshadow what the impact of those tools might be, but having those tools is not enough. So, one of my favorite kind of things that people will say is like, well, my people aren't going, but I did give them the feedback. Right. And so if the desired impact is that people are growing, and one of the ways to help people grow is to give them feedback, giving them feedback is not enough. Right. Of course, it has to be well done. And there's some reciprocity to it and timing. But the point is, we want to pay attention to the impact, not only the behavior. Right. Okay. So let's keep going here. Okay. So part of the question is, how do you develop the skills and capacities to be needed to be future ready, and thinking about, the future as maybe 10 minutes from now or 10 months or 10 years. So one of the places that I turn is that we need to learn from experience. So going back to the Nicomachean ethics quote from Aristotle, we are learning from our experiences. We become builders building. Right? And so how do we actually learn from our experiences? I'm really worried that the experiences that we've had with climate or kind of belongingness and racial equity, or questions of how do we actually live in a diverse world that doesn't see things the same way, do not result necessarily in learning and wisdom just because we've had the experience. We have to learn from our experiences. So this slide is really about kind of conventional ways of learning. Often, our subject matter expertise that we've gained relies on these yellow boxes of kind of factual or conceptual or procedural or conditional knowledge, all very important, and yet maybe not enough for the kind of leadership learning that is needed to run our organizations today in the face of complexity and ambiguity and volatility and human conditions that may baffle us if we just take a kind of procedural or factual approach. So here we need metacognitive approaches and reflection capacity. So I've already asked you some reflection and questions, and we actually have to learn how to do these things often. It can be a little inconvenient for people who are attached to their subject matter expertise. We'd like to know that we know what we're doing. We like to kind of walk around with a kind of sense that not only do we know what we're doing, we're in our comfort zone, but that other people see us as knowing what we're doing. And so it can be kind of inconvenient and troublesome to have to grow ourselves, to learn from our experience, to kind of take on a beginner's mind, represent a bit of an identity abrasion. And so I want to kind of acknowledge that minor crisis that's in front of us about learning new things, learning to lead with more complexity than matches our current mindset. Hi, Emily.
So it sounds like you're saying that this is equally important for managers and employees.
Oh, yeah. So for me, everyday leadership is not about positional authority. Everyday leadership is for each of us and for all of us. And so if people do have positional authority, you have a capital L leadership title or role, I hope that your everyday leadership is on point because you're having deep impact on the organizational culture. Even not having deep impact on the organizational culture in a positive fashion is in itself an impact that matters from someone who has positional authority. But my idea of everyday leadership is that it's a kind of invitation for all of us to have impact. That impact is not the domain of people with a title. That we make a difference to each other. And so I really want to kind of honor and appreciate that there's often a kind of someone who's influential because they remember birthdays or they ask and reflect on people's comments in a meeting. They're curious about you. They're happy to see each people. They bring a positive energy and spirit to the workplace, to projects, to the capacity for the organization, to be a place that people actually want to work, and to helping us all kind of think more deeply or better. All of these kinds of things matter, and your job title is not what creates these things. So thank you so much for that kind of reminder to say that, Emily. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these things that I just talked about. And so in terms of building, reflective capacity, part of this is about, kind of taking enough time to be able to think about what we're doing. I've been, working with enough executives in this, in the spirit of looking at everyday leadership for long enough that I feel quite confident saying that not only in their words, but in my own assessment, one of the things that we're missing the most is just a little bit of time to think and increase our intentionality. So just think about how the day went or how you want the day to go. And we're missing it in terms of our time, because our days are perhaps too busy. But we're now, because we've been in the practice of busyness collectively, because we are over-indexing kind of on unsustainable probably levels of productivity, that what we wind up taking out of the equation is the time to think with wisdom. And so I'm pretty worried about that. And I've also heard many people talking about just needing time to think and to think with others. And so we need to build some reflective capacity so that we can learn from our experience and be a little bit wiser in our tomorrows. This is a kind of hope for us. Some of the things that we have in front of us really require some difficult conversations. And so we don't want to come kind of barreling into them with a kind of, like, let's just get this done and decided. Some of these aren't situations that actually can be resolved. So we need to be able to sit with. So there are some techniques that you can use to be able to do this. You can get into your norms, some after action reviews to simply ask what went well, what went poorly, how can we do better next time, a kind of stop, start, continue, kind of regular questioning. And we often need to get used to asking these things, but actually once we get used to asking and answering these questions well with enough psychological safety and voice from stakeholders, we really can be able to move forward. It also helps us to be able to sit with things that are difficult and that we can't resolve in our kind of problem solver, urgent mindset. We tend to avoid the things that we don't have the skills for. And so we are not building enough muscle and capacity to be able to resolve and sit with some of our hardest problems in some instances. And so let's keep going here just for the sake of time. The second thing that I wanted to kind of talk about here is this idea of belongingness as a really fundamental capacity. And one of the reasons I think that we don't have a sense of facility around belongingness in a very diverse world where we're speaking different languages and have different lived experiences, different cultures. We often live in different places. Some people have, will never see each other in the face of work because they're not co-located, perhaps not on the same continent, never mind same office. And so part of what we can do is we can orient around differential experience. That you can actually learn something new from people who have a different perspective than you do, even if it might be a little bit harder to find them, might be a little bit more of a walk over to their perspective because it's not as easy to see things the same way. Right. But if we can actually orient towards differential experience and welcome that in as a normative part of our everyday leadership, we might be able to lead for belongingness with a more kind of credible and robust presence. This slide is about this idea of kind of sitting and holding paradox. This idea of being confident at the same time, knowing that there are things that you don't know yet. So being able to lead while saying that. There are a lot of kind of questions in the domain of a complex world that we just don't know the answer, to. You might need to be able to stick around and lead the way. For example, in this kind of return to office, there are some technical things to resolve. Where are people's offices? Where are the new offices? Are they now sharing an office? We'll probably figure that kind of thing out eventually. What does it mean to be on a team that doesn't necessarily see each other regularly? And how can we create norms that are shared and people having a sense that they are on the same team because they have shared goals? We might not know yet, but you can be confident that it matters. And so being able to hold the paradox of feeling confident and yet not knowing the answer is one of the domains that we need to be able to develop in our everyday leadership. Couple of other quick things. Since I've mentioned feedback so many times, I just thought I'd bring in this slide that I like from Zenger and Folkman here. That actually, it tends to be the case that leaders and managers and peers don't necessarily want to give negative feedback, but actually people want to hear it. They know that they grow from doing that. People tend to want to grow. And so, we're not necessarily doing a favor with our avoidance of feedback skills. We're keeping us out of relationship and keeping us from creating an environment that helps people to unleash their potential with the information that they need to be able to grow. So overall here, I've been talking about a kind of changing face of leadership and the way that we're interacting every day. That, if management used to be a lot of, kind of managing systems, that's not going away, certainly. But it all used to be really focused on kind of transferring information. But in the face of technologies that allow us to communicate much more smoothly, actually some new things are coming up. And so what I've been pointing to here as a whole, or this kind of capacity to build more meaning making in, to create shared goals and to kind of make sense of out of the context of ambiguity, to lead for belongingness in a world where people don't necessarily know each other and feel quite disconnected. And the work might be so kind of complex and different that we need a sense of shared goals. We need to be pretty explicit about that to be able to have experiences of belongingness when we often feel apart and disconnected. And then leading to be able to unleash potential, not just to supervise tasks, but to actually be a catalyst for other people's capacity. So these are the three things that I think that we really need to be able to focus into and on. This gives us a chance to really just ask the question of how can you create more impactful everyday moments? And so I'll leave you with that. It's really an invitation. And so Emily, are you coming back with a question that we should take on right away?
I think this is the perfect way to end, actually. I was going to mention, how teams, to Alex's question, are ebbing and flowing and growing and shrinking, and we aren't necessarily in person all the time. And just, is there something you would leave us with about that way of creating belongingness after, that might unify people in those circumstances?
Yeah, well, I think first just asking the question, and kind of a reflective or metacognitive stance on that, getting more intention in there around leading for belonging. Sometimes we lead for kind of like for productivity, and I'm not saying that these things are actually separate, but only leading for productivity without leading for belongingness might leave some value on the table in terms of the power of the team being able to collaborate and find each other and find a place where they can really kind of connect in a way that actually might help the productivity. And so I think asking the question is the first thing, and then building the skills and range and the tolerating that you actually might not know how to lead for belongingness yet. You might need to work with your team and with yourself to learn to lead for belongingness. And so tolerating that as a worthwhile pursuit, getting some information and working with your team to build the conditions where it's working. I think it's something that we don't know how to do yet collectively. And so I think, the answer is not for or waiting in some journal article for you. I think it might be an exploratory process where you can get some feedback from the key stakeholders and move forward as your own kind of path of development. Okay, so I think that we'll end, and I should probably advance the slide just in case there are any last questions. And I certainly want you to be able to see the kind of address here. And I'll just say thank you so much for engaging questions in the chat and for your participation and for showing up. Appreciate your interest.
I had to unmute myself. Sorry about that, Dr. Brooks. I just wanted to say on behalf of the audience, this was a really wonderful discussion. And I did want to have, since we do have 2-3 minutes left, Dr. Brooks, as I was listening to your discussion, the question that came up to my mind was generational differences and how teams now are diverse from experience levels, particularly with some of the changes in the work environment now. What's your view of how we as leaders can manage such a wide range of backgrounds in terms of experience levels and some of the ways in which these generations have evolved and developed? Any thoughts around that?
Well, I think my biggest hope is that we incorporate a kind of spirit of inquiry and the kind of capacity to actually hold ourselves in positive regard when we don't necessarily know the answer. So, the young people, the kind of thinking and yearnings of the next generation are not necessarily the same as your own. And thank goodness, in a lot of cases, we can actually learn from each other rather than just knowing and the information transfer going from the older, more, the person who's been around with more tenure to the younger person. It actually might go both ways. And actually, if we can respect that process as a robust part of the workplace and respect ourselves as leading a process, not just knowing the way as problem solvers, I think it opens up a kind of a way of being at work that might just be appropriate for today. You don't have to know everything to be able to lead. And so that's a little bit of a differentiation from subject matter expertise. So we need a broader concept, especially when we're trying to lead, where concepts of productivity include things like wellness and belongingness and some sense of kind of shared experience. And so we might have some things to learn. I think that's okay. We actually can learn. We can lead for learning.
Lead with learning and really sort of operating with a sense of humility around the importance of lifelong learning. And so I appreciate your perspective, Dr. Brooks. And as you can see from the attendees, what a wonderful discussion. As much as we wish to perhaps have this type of discussion in person, you've made it quite engaging from a virtual experience perspective. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you, Dr. Brooks. You are such a great ambassador for Yale and for great leaders that are attending, and we look forward to all of you attending our future webinars. I speak on behalf of the entire audience when I say how appreciative we are of having this opportunity to partner with you and our colleagues at Yale. Best of luck, everyone. Be well. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.